This sparsely promoted show called Road to UFC could end up changing the entire landscape of the UFC in a couple short years. This last weekend, we saw the opening round of Road to UFC Season 2 from Shanghai, and I personally am more convinced than ever that this could end up totally changing the talent pool and roster of the world's largest MMA promotion. Hey guys, my name is Chris. I am the owner of MMA Ecosystem. I report on Asian MMA news, also do some stuff with records, manage a couple fighters, lots of things in between, but mostly just have a massive passion for Asian MMA. I gotta tell you guys, watching Road to UFC last weekend, one of the most life-giving, fun, invigorating parts of the whole year for me. It's basically this collaboration of some of the best talent all across Asia competing in one weekend, all against each other. For me personally, it's a lot of fighters that I know, some people I consider friends, sometimes having to fight each other, so I have a lot of personal vested interest in this, but just coming out of the weekend, I personally just felt more passionate than ever about Asian MMA. Watching all of these athletes compete, their stories, where they come from, is so exciting to finally see these athletes on a bigger and bigger stage, kind of coming out of the shadows of their own localized fan bases and getting to compete on a larger stage. And I think that one of the big stars of the whole weekend was the UFC Shanghai PI. For a long time, it's been a little bit hot cold on the talent that they've been able to produce in the UFC. And for a long time, it's been a little bit hit or miss. We had the debacle of Contender Series in 2021 where 5 of the 6 fighters that competed lost. And this year at the PI, they had 8 athletes in Road to UFC. And of those 8 athletes, 7 of them won their fights this weekend. The lone loss was a very close split decision. That was the Shuya Kamikubo fight against Bayargung Jalaisa. And Bayargung, he lost a very close split decision to Shuya Kamikubo. Looked really good, showed himself as a top prospect out of China, even out of a loss. Probably the most impressive fighter to lose this whole weekend in Road to UFC. Probably the most impressive fighter to lose out of Road to UFC this year for me. But the other 7 all looked incredible. You had Jinyu Shiye, who blew through his competition against Billy Boss Lutan. You had Tai Laka score that incredible elbow. Lee Kai Win winning the shootout with Liu Kai. What an exciting fight that was. All across the board, the Shanghai PI showed out, they delivered, and they've got an incredibly exciting batch of talent. I just am happy for them to finally have just a big solid win under their belt. Going into the semifinals, they've got 6 fighters in the semis. That's a massive ratio, and I fully expect some of those guys will be winning UFC contracts. But the UFC Shanghai PI was really just a microcosm of something much bigger going on in Asia, because I think that in just a year or two, Road to UFC is gonna get really popular, and it's gonna become a really big part of the UFC's ultimate global expansion. It already is a huge part of them expanding into places like India and Indonesia, places that have been extremely underrepresented in the UFC, but now we're starting to finally get some traction, some development, some fighters that have a path to the UFC. Just think about this for a second. Think about, what are the top most populated countries in the world? Well, you don't have to think. These are the 15 most populated countries in the world at the moment of June 2023. Think about which countries of this list the UFC already has a big presence. Of course, obviously the USA, Mexico, Russia, Brazil, those countries are well represented in the UFC. But look at those top 2, China and India. They make up 25% of the world's population. China is just now starting to get a pretty solid representation in the UFC. They've got 12 to 15 fighters, but there's still a lot more room to grow. India has literally 1 fighter. Indonesia, literally 1 fighter in the UFC. And just think, if the UFC can capture these fan bases, bring them into their ranks, how much more can the UFC grow? Not only in their roster size, but also in their audience, their revenue, all of these things. Could they eventually build Shanghai PI-esque headquarters in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Japan, in Korea, in India? The doors are wide open for all these things, especially if things like Road to UFC just take off and are able to create more talent. The thing is that the UFC has wanted a presence in a lot of these countries for a long time, but in order to have a real presence in countries like India and Indonesia, they need banner carriers. They need people like Anshul Jubli and Jekka Sargi to open the doors. They need fighters for fans to rally around, and they've never really had that. For them to provide a path to the UFC for these fighters where they can get a couple extra fights under their belt is huge for the development of the sport. You know, you look at this last weekend where Team India went 0-2, Team Indonesia went 0-4, really hard losses for these countries, but long term, I don't think that this is actually that big of a loss, because for Road to UFC, just the exposure, the opportunities, that's a victory in and of itself. Because in order to get to the point where China is at, where they're starting to just crank out high-level content left and right, they have to go through the season of putting themselves up against top-tier talent from other countries around the world, seeing how they do, seeing what weaknesses need to be buffed out. And eventually, I know that India and Indonesia will turn a corner at the highest level and be able to just like every week crank out new fighters and stars. For India, I feel like there's already a couple fighters that are ready to make that leap. They're just locked away in contracts with other promotions like Matrix Fight Night and some with one championship. But just imagine a world where places like India, Indonesia, China, Thailand, Japan, Korea, Malaysia even, where they have like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of UFC fans in the country, and the UFC is making regular stops to Mumbai, Shanghai, Beijing, Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, all these places where they either rarely or have never even been before, because there's this massive fan base that needs to be served. Road to UFC Season 2 was much bigger than Season 1, especially in these localized countries. For Contender Series, it's a little bit hard to bring Asian fighters over and have them compete and build them as stars, because it takes place in the US, it takes place in the US time zone, and by having these fights in Asia, in an Asian prime time, it allows these stars to be built in their own way. A lot of these fighters and fights could have actually taken place in the UFC, thinking about Mark Klamaco versus Lee Jung-hyun, and other of these fights probably more of a Contender Series level, where some of these fights probably a step below Contender Series level, but it gives them an opportunity to have the platform to expose themselves to what it's like to be in the UFC and have that level of high competition. For an up-and-coming fighter from Indonesia, they might still be a couple steps away from being in the UFC, but for the UFC to allow them to develop and not just get snatched up by a lower level of promotion, they're actually giving them a place to just get some fights under their belt, get more experience, and for them to have a connection with the UFC while they build their fan base. It's literally a perfect system for developing countries like Indonesia and India. And just take a look at some of the stars from this season of Road to UFC and look at how young all these guys are. Some of the guys that impressed me the most this last weekend from Road to UFC were Ray Tsuruya, who blew through his competition, 20 years old. Ija quickly submitted a really good grappler in Wutsata Bieka with an armbar. Really young guy. Peter Daniso, flying knee knockout against Kai Shimshong, 22 years old. Could potentially be the first fighter out of Thailand on the male side. Then you had Tai Laka with that incredible elbow. Really young kid, almost still looks like he's in high school. Rong Ju, still a really young guy. Incredible win that could be a big comeback statement of his career. We'll see how he does later in the tournament. Eventually, I think he's gonna have to fight Shin Haraguchi, who is another massive standout character in this season of Road to UFC for me. Shin Haraguchi, Ray Tsuruya, just one of many of these Japanese killers that I keep telling y'all about. But I gotta tell you, the biggest surprise for me of Road to UFC this year, the one guy that totally surprised me was Sumit Kumar. Now, I've always been the first guy to say that I thought that he didn't belong in Road to UFC, that his record was nothing to be impressed about. In fact, the couple things that have been falsified on his record. But he totally surprised me even through a loss. He fought Choi Sung-gook, who was a finalist at last year's Road to UFC. I expected this to be a wash, but Sumit Kumar came out there and fought his freaking ass off. This guy went for the takedown over and over and over. And despite, yeah, there's a lot of mistakes in his game plan, he still lost by a decision. For a 4-0 or whatever his record is, for a fighter with only a few fights, really, really young, 22 years old, he showed that he wanted to be in the UFC more than anybody else. And guys, I promise you, in a couple years, you're gonna hear this guy's name again. What Sumit needs to do is he needs to go back to AKA or Team Alpha Male, and he needs to get a couple fights with Uriah Faber's promotion or with the LFA against some other fighters that have 3-4 fights on their record, and just get a couple notable, solid, manageable wins under his belt. Then I think that he's gonna be a force in the UFC, especially once he brings his hands along. This guy could be really, really dangerous. He was a little bit one note for me in his Road to UFC appearance. He had incredible cardio, really good wrestling, but from the top position wasn't really able to mount a whole lot of offense. And then eventually Choi Sung-gook was able to land his shots and win the decision. But Sumit Kumar, I will never doubt this guy again, and I fully believe that he's gonna be back someday. Give him a couple years, he needs to polish out a couple things, but this guy, I was wrong about him. So now we turn to the semi-final round of Road to UFC. What can we expect from the 8 fights that are up on deck, most likely for Singapore on August 26th? I'm sure the UFC is just kind of waiting to get word from the fighters if they're all ready to go for that date. If a lot of them are not medically cleared to make that date, I could see them pushing it back. They're not gonna wanna get a lot of replacements for the semifinal round. So hopefully August 26th alongside a UFC card should be any day that that's announced. But what can we expect from those fights themselves? Well, a lot of them are really, really close and hard to predict. Here are your country by country standings at the end of the opening round to the UFC. Of course, China taking the lead with 7 fighters, all of those from the UFC, PI in Shanghai. Really landmark performance by China this year in Road to UFC. And then in second place, you've got both Korea and Japan at 4 fighters apiece. These 3 countries have kind of been the ones to take over most of the tournament in this year and last year, China, Korea, and Japan. And this year we've got Korea and Japan tied for second place. And then that leaves the lone fighter outside of those 3, Mark Climaco, who is an American fighter with Filipino ethnicity, and he is representing Philippines in this tournament, and I really think that he could go far. Of course, he is fighting Ray Tsuruya in the flyweight semifinals. Here's the full lineup for the semifinals of Road to UFC Season 2. Let's kind of go down the lineup of all 8 of these fights, shall we? One of the most competitive fights that could definitely be in the UFC today, Mark Climaco versus Ray Tsuruya. This could be a really difficult fight to predict. It could end up coming down to the striking if neither guy is able to impose their game on the ground. Mark Climaco, pretty good wrestler, pretty good hands as well. He could have an advantage against Ray Tsuruya if they keep it standing, but Ray is just an absolute shark on the ground. And if he can get Mark Climaco to the ground, he could work for a submission. But this is one of the hardest ones for me to pick. Ray Tsuruya just looks so dominant in his first fight, so I have to go with him to win that fight. I would also honestly pick him to win the whole flyweight tournament as well. Jinyu Shiye showed a good showing in his opening round fight where he was able to take down Billy Pasolutan and pound him out in the first round. Also kind of an unknown fighter, not a lot of people knew about him going into that fight, but he is looking good and he's with the PI, so you never know what to expect from him, his strengths and improvements. So he looked good. He could be a dark horse in the whole entire season. Of course, he's going up against Choi Sung-gook. You know, Choi is an interesting fighter because he was able to make it to the finals last year. He was able to get past Sumit Kumar's relentless takedown attack this year. But in all honesty, it was a little bit of a letdown performance. You know, Choi fighting a little bit slower than a lot of other flyweights, throwing single strikes at a time. Really accurate, precise kind of guy, but honestly, I don't know how much farther he's going to be able to get in this tournament, especially going up against really hyper-aggressive fighters like Climaco and Tsuruya. Even Jinyu Shiye, I don't know if he's going to be able to point fight his way to a UFC contract in this tournament. And then looking at the bantamweights, we've got Xiaolong versus Shuya Kamikubo. Kamikubo, a lot of people comparing him to like a Japanese Nick Diaz or Nate Diaz, which that title for me kind of already belongs to Shinya Aoki, so I don't know what what we're talking about there, but he's going up against Xiaolong. Good to finally see Xiaolong get a win under a UFC banner fight. Of course, he came up short in his Contender Series fight, had to bow out of Road to UFC last year before it even got started because of an ankle injury. So he was able to fight and get a win. Although, you know, for Xiaolong, it seems like he has a little bit of trouble bringing things out of first gear. He's a little bit of a slow starter, sometimes seems to be holding back a little bit, but he was able to get the split decision win this year, and I don't know how he's going to do against Shuya Kamikubo. He's a very experienced guy. I think he thinks things through really intensely, probably kind of overthinks things sometimes. Against Shuya, he's going to have to let himself go a little bit more, especially with the striking, because Shuya is going to try and bring him to the ground. He's going to put a lot of pressure on him, and Xiaolong hasn't always reacted very well to pressure. So I don't know if it's something mental with him, but he needs to figure those things out if he's going to go against one of the toughest fighters of this whole tournament, Shuya Kamikubo. Kamikubo, my personal pick to win the bantamweight tournament, although for him, I think he's going to be fighting Daramisi Jawapasi in the finals, but that could also be a really tough fight for him as well. He did win just by the skin of his teeth in a split decision against Ba Argung, so he was definitely tested in that fight. He's going to be tested several more times before this tournament is over. Of course, on the other side of the bantamweight bracket, you have Daramisi Jawapasi against Lee Chong-ho. Lee Chong-ho showed exactly what I thought he would against Ranarudra. He was able to take him down, pound him out. Very strong, broad-shouldered bantamweight that likes to take people down and impose his will on them. Against Daramisi, is he going to be able to do that? I don't know. Daramisi is a very prolific wrestler and grappler, and personally, I think Daramisi might be one of the best prospects out of China right now. And I think that probably he's going to take this fight and win it by submission. But that's a very good fight. Both guys are really fun, exciting grapplers. Hopefully we get to see both of these guys in the UFC as well. Then at featherweight, I feel like things are a little bit more clear cut here. We've got Yi Jia fighting Kim Sang-wong. And Sang-wong, you know, he got a decent knockout in his opening round fight. Yi Jia, of course, quickly submitting Wutsatsbieka via first round armbar. On the other side of the tournament, you've got Lee Kai-Win fighting Kuya Kanda, who took a very hard-fought decision win over Ibu Gele. In this fight, I think I side with Lee Kai-Win to get the win here. He has a lot of great high-profile experience. He's a very good, heavy-handed striker, and I think that he'll probably continue his run through the tournament against Kim Sang-won, but you never know. Sang-won was also kind of a dark horse coming into this tournament. Ultimately, I think we're going to see Yi Jia fight Lee Kai-Win in the finals, which should be an incredible fight between two fighters that are really popular, have really good bright futures in the UFC, but I think we're going to see Yi Jia finally get that contract. If he fights Lee Kai-Win, he's going to be able to take him down and grapple his way to a win. Of course, that leaves us with the lightweight tournament bracket. Some really fun fighters in this tournament. We've got Rong Ju fighting Kim Song-uk, who personally is the Korean I'm most excited about. Really fun personality, a lot of charisma, huge following because he was on the Physical 100 show and looked really good with that Darce choke in the first round. Honestly, a very big standout performance for me, especially on the Korean side in Road UFC. Of course, he's going to be fighting Rong Ju, who is really experienced and the one fighter in this tournament that has already fought in the UFC. He's fought there 3 times. He looked dynamic with his right hook knockout against Hong Sung Chan. I think he's going to continue to overperform, and I lean Rong Ju just because of his experience against Kim Song-uk, but definitely expect that I could even be surprised by Kim's performance. On the other side of the bracket, we've got Bate Bull fighting Shin Haraguchi. Shin looked absolutely unstoppable in his fight. Really young guy, one of the least experienced fighters in Road to UFC, but he was able to blow through Windry Patalima, pound him out in the second round. I think that in the finals, we're probably going to see Rong Ju fight Shin Haraguchi for the UFC contract. That's a hard one to pick. It's hard to pick against someone that is that good of a wrestler, that physical, and that good at just smashing people through to victory. So I'm gonna lean towards Shin to win this whole thing, but Rong Ju is definitely, I definitely have my eye on him. So that is your preview for Road to UFC semifinals. The finals hopefully to go down in China at the end of the year, but of course a lot of things have to happen before that is official, so no official word on that just yet. You tell me, what were some of your favorite parts of Road to UFC? Tell me which fighters that you were most excited, disappointed for. But for now, subscribe to the channel. Appreciate all you guys. Have a good weekend.